Okay. I'd like to officially welcome you to our session, Buying Everything Black, Going Beyond DEI Talk in Collection Development with Mallary Rawls, Adam Beauchamp, and Hannah Menendez. Before I turn things over to the presenters, I just wanted to give a few reminders. All attendees are muted. We will have a section at the end, about 10 minutes for Q&A, where you can unmute yourself and ask questions. And then you're also welcome to use the chat box for questions and comments as we're going along. Please note that the chat log will be saved and made available after the presentation. So if you want to preserve your anonymity in the chat log, please rename yourself in the participant list before you post anything. And all the conference sessions are being recorded, and we will send you a link to the recordings by July 23rd. You'll also receive a link to the survey and for feedback on the conference, so please complete that when you get that. And now I'm going to turn things over to the, stop sharing my screen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I'm still making sure that you all see my screen, but I'm still trying to figure out how to see my notes. Sorry about this.
That's okay. I'll go ahead and do your introductions now.
Okay.
Mallary Rawls is a Humanities Librarian at Florida State University, serving as the liaison to African American Studies, International Affairs, English, Middle Eastern Studies, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Mallary's current research interests include critical pedagogy, critical race theory, vocational awe, and neutrality in libraries. Adam Beauchamp is also a Humanities Librarian at Florida State University, serves as liaison for history, philosophy, and religion. Adam's current research interests include critical pedagogy, ethical assessment and research in libraries, and the historical relationship of archives and libraries to colonialism. And then our final presenter, Hannah Menendez, is a student in the Master of Science in Information program at Florida State. She's a graduate assistant in the FSU Libraries, Social Sciences, Arts, and Humanities Department. So if you're ready, Mallary, please go forward.
Okay. I think I'm ready. Are you all seeing two screens or just one?
Just one.
We're not seeing the full screen slide though. We're seeing like the, oh, there you go.
There you go. Perfect.
Okay. The only issue is that when I do that, I can't see my notes.
Do you want me to share instead? I can do that.
That's fine.
No, we do. We got to slide up.
Yes, everything's good.
Okay, sorry you all. Sorry to everyone. I will introduce myself again. So my name is Mallary Rawls. I'm the Humanities Librarian. I don't know if Hannah and Adam also want to introduce themselves one more time.
Hey, I'm Adam Beauchamp, Humanities Librarian at Florida State.
And I will introduce myself again too, because I am no longer a student in the FSU School of Information. I recently just started a job as a research instruction librarian at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas, which is where I am now. And I am a subject librarian for the English and Communication Studies departments.
Congrats to Hannah. Thank you all for joining us today. We are at FSU, where we have done most of our thinking about DEI in collection development. It is a primarily white institution in Tallahassee, Florida, with over 40,000 enrolled students. We acknowledge that Florida has always been on native land, or has always been native land, populated by diverse communities, represented today by our partners the Seminole Tribe of Florida. As members of the FSU community, we honor that partnership and friendship and hope that our acknowledgements and actions keep the path between us straight and clean. We acknowledge that FSU is located on land that is ancestral and traditional territory of the Appalachian Nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation, and the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida. We believe it's important to keep that institutional context in mind as we explore diversity, equity, and inclusion in our library's collection development, past and present. So today we're going to talk, I'm going to start out by talking about the current state of DEI in collection development. When I began discussing this, thinking about this, the first place I started was the ALA Diverse Collection and Interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights. It states that materials should not be excluded because of origin, background, or views contributing to their creation. A diverse collection should contain content by and about a wide array of people and cultures that authentically reflect a variety of ideas, information, stories, and experiences. That Bill of Rights also goes on to state that library workers have an obligation to select, maintain, and support access to content on subjects by diverse authors and creators. Library workers should be addressing popular demand, community input, address collection gaps, and unexpressed information needs. The Library Bill of Rights, the interpretation was last amended in June 2018, and if you haven't read it or if you're unfamiliar with it, there's a link at the end in our bibliography. The next place I looked was an article by Matthew Cisnek and Courtney Young, and it is Diversity Collection Assessment in Large Academic Libraries, and it was published in July of 2010. And the article discusses various means of assessment used in the development of diversity-related collections. Assessment can be both retrospective and forward-thinking. Retrospective meaning focusing on past acquisitions and the current status of the collection, and forward-thinking meaning focusing on areas of the collection, focusing on the future of collection development and planning. They also discuss collection diversity assessment and future directions. This is an older article, but it's also worth reading, and there will also be a link in the bibliography. This year in April, there was an article published in Inside Higher Ed, and it's called Library Leaders Lack Confidence in Diversity Strategies. So within that article, there's a link to an Ithaca survey. The Ithaca survey is called National Movements for Racial Justice and Academic Library Leadership. There's some key findings in this Ithaca report. I've got them listed up here, but fewer directors believe that libraries have well-developed strategies relative to 2019, and the majority of directors have not developed strategies to recenter their collections around authors of color or anti-racist content. So the survey is a good overview of where academic libraries are in relation to DEI efforts in collection development. And one of my takeaways from the Ithaca study is that collection development strategies and policies are wrapped up in larger issues in academic libraries and libraries in general, but they're wrapped up in issues of hiring, recruitment, and retention of Black, Indigenous, and people of color employees, and also who has the power to make collections decisions. One other thing that kind of goes over the current state of DEI is there was a recent ACRL presentation, and it's from May this year, and it's called Cultures of Collecting, Sustaining Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Collection Development, from which there are 3 presentations. One is from Tamar Evangelistia Daltrey, Roxanne Bukowski, and Scarlett Gavan. And I will be discussing that presentation a little bit later in this presentation. But the current state of DEI initiatives in academic libraries is scattered, where some library workers and libraries are really focusing on policy, where others are catching up. There isn't a consistent model for addressing DEI in collection development initiatives, and there seems to be a lack of confidence for academic libraries to address and recenter these initiatives.
So before we talk about how to inject the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion into our collection development strategies, we must first recognize that these efforts cannot be separated from some of the broader challenges library workers face when engaged with modern scholarly communication. We live and work in a capitalist society. Publishing is dominated by multinational corporations, oligarchies of journal publishers, database distributors, and integrated library systems. Peer review and editorial labor are often uncompensated. Information and scholarship, funded in part by public monies in the form of grants or at state universities and colleges, are commodified, repackaged, and sold for private profit. And when knowledge is no longer a public good, but a private commodity, it cannot be truly inclusive. Private property is by definition exclusive, so there's that. How does this relate to DEI work? Well, racism and capitalism are intertwined. In 1983, Cedric Robinson coined the term racial capitalism in his book, Black Marxism, The Making of a Black Radical Tradition, both to explain how race and capitalism are related and to argue that historically, all capitalism has been and is racial capitalism. So what does this mean? There's a robust and multidisciplinary literature on this that could be the subject of an entire presentation. But to put it briefly, scholars of racial capitalism argue that capitalism is not purely a rational, universalizing system that eliminates pre-modern social hierarchies like feudalism and racism. Capitalism formed in the context of existing European racist social structures, absorbed them, and continually reproduces them. The racial categories may have changed, but the use of race to organize capitalism is consistent. And while capitalism is supposed to create value based solely on market forces, in practice, racial capitalism allows for that value to be distorted along racial lines, usually to control labor and minimize radicalism among workers. If you want to dig into the history and theory of racial capitalism, I recommend Arun Kudnani's piece, What is Racial Capitalism? And we have a link for that in our bibliography. So I want to use spatial segregation as our metaphor in order to tie this to libraries. Many of us are familiar with redlining, a practice used by policymakers and financial institutions to systematically devalue and underinvest in Black and brown neighborhoods, not based on the quality of housing or a rational valuing of the land, but because of the race of the residents. And I found two examples of redlining maps that you see on the slide here, one of Miami and one of New Orleans. Conversely, white neighborhoods enjoyed good credit, access to capital, rising property values, and greater investment in infrastructure. This system was part of government policy from the New Deal until the late 1960s when redlining was made illegal. However, during the 1970s and 80s, as the federal role in fair housing was reduced and handed over to the private sector, race continued to be a factor in the market value of real estate. Today, we all understand the racial connotations when someone talks about, quote, good neighborhoods versus bad neighborhoods. We might describe the history of publishing and library collection development practices in similar terms. Libraries themselves were legally segregated until the 1966 Supreme Court case Brown v. Louisiana. Scholarly contributions of non-white authors were limited in number by publishers, excluded from libraries, or segregated in the stacks by classifying them, for example, as folklore instead of literature, or as anthropology instead of history. Look at the Library of Congress classification system, and you can still see this epistemological redlining at work. That our monograph approval plans still rely on this classification system to run their selection algorithms is one of the challenges to building diverse collections that are also inclusive. But just as in housing, the privatization of academic publishing increases the exclusivity of knowledge. Only the wealthiest institutions of higher learning can afford to provide access to a wide range of knowledge products. This coincides with disinvestment in higher ed by state governments, requiring students to go deeper into debt in order to access privatized knowledge, a debt burden that hits BIPOC communities more severely because decades of discrimination have denied communities of color that all-important generational asset, home ownership. In the Harvard Law Review, Nancy Leung elaborated on racial capitalism, which she succinctly defined as deriving social and economic value from the racial identity of another person. Here, we're not only talking about devaluing the labor of non-white workers or neighborhoods. Leung points to instances where the presence of non-white bodies creates additional value for white people or institutions. For example, predominantly white institutions like universities use non-white people to acquire social and economic value when their presence is used for marketing the institution. Think about how many people of color are on our university marketing materials compared to the actual demographics of our student populations. Did any of those students agree to have their images used in such a way? Do they benefit from being included on glossy brochures, or does the institution? Similarly, what does it say when the library publicizes acquisition of quote unquote diverse materials as evidence of our DEI initiatives when at the same time our profession remains overwhelmingly white? Are we doing DEI work when we announce the purchase of a new African-American newspaper database, but the profits go to one of these multinational corporations with an all-white board, and the community that produced that newspaper can't access the database? Are we just deriving social and economic value from the racial identity of that community? To continue our housing metaphor, this sort of DEI collection building reminds me of gentrification, where white people or institutions use their unequal buying power to scoop up real estate in what were historically communities of color, cashing in on the cultural value created by that community, while the community members themselves are priced out of the neighborhood. This is all to say that we need to be reflective and a bit self-critical of what seem like diverse acquisition practices. We must think about how diversity is being co-opted as a marketing tool to increase profits for global publishing companies. I didn't have to dig deep in my email inbox to find publisher solicitations with phrases like, and I've redacted the company's names, company is the leader in ethnic primary sources, the capital letters were in the original, or offering to sell me ebook titles repackaged from other series into a DEI collection. And more importantly, who are we building collections for? Who will have access to the diverse content we license, and who is deliberately excluded from them, or worse, actively harmed by the content licenses we sign? So it turns out the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is complex and not easily accomplished without taking a critical look at the very foundations of our economy. However, that doesn't mean we can't make real changes at every step of the collection management process, even as we recognize there are much bigger systemic issues to work through. So while we should think critically about DEI work that consists mostly of cutting a check to ProQuest, I'm not saying we shouldn't purchase materials from the major publishing corporations. We should take every reasonable opportunity to diversify the voices represented in our collections. However, we can simultaneously seek out other models that are more equitable and inclusive. For example, at FSU, we recently contributed funds to the American Prison Newspapers Project. This digitization project by Reveal Digital, part of JSTOR, uses crowdsourcing from libraries to create open access primary source collections from underrepresented voices. Once a project reaches its funding goal to cover the cost of digitization, the collection is made open access. The American Prison Newspapers Project is working to digitize newspapers published by incarcerated citizens throughout the United States, adding an important perspective to our understanding of the criminal justice system and the experiences of incarcerated people. Reveal Digital recently announced that they have met their funding goal for this project, so it will soon be available to anyone with internet access. Notably, this would exclude those men and women who are currently incarcerated, so there are limits to what any library's DEI initiative can accomplish, but increasing awareness of and access to the voices of incarcerated people may lead to other liberatory action. I'm also working with my colleagues at FSU to contribute content into this project. We have several newspapers published in Florida prisons from the mid-20th century in our state documents collection. Reveal Digital will digitize this content and return to us the originals and digital files. So even if your institution doesn't have the monetary resources to fund projects like this, there may be opportunities to contribute unique content from your local collections. Deselection, or weeding, is also an important process for maintaining a healthy library collection. But how do we weed our collection for diversity, equity, and inclusion? My experiences with weeding, which have only been in the context of large academic libraries, have always taken the form of large book deselection projects. In those, we have used quantitative data, including publication date and number of circulations, to identify quote-unquote low-use titles for deselection. This applies a market value to each individual volume, where age and past checkouts are interpreted as indicators of future utility. These identified titles might then be shared with librarians and faculty for review, but in spreadsheets so large and on such short timelines that a thorough evaluation of each title is nearly impossible. The result may adversely affect the diversity of our collection. At predominantly white institutions, where curricula have historically ignored the scholarly contributions of communities of color, we might predict that demand for books written by or about people of color would be lower, depressing past circulations and injecting a historical bias into our seemingly rational and neutral weeding criteria. This work is also organized by call number ranges, typically. This too injects biases into the process, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation. For example, at FSU, we are currently weeding the physical book collection. One of my tasks is to review the titles in the E call number ranges, the history of the United States. Within E, we have about the same number of books on African Americans as we do on the Civil War. These ranges have similar circulation stats, so the number of books eligible for deselection by our quantitative measures are also similar. However, the African American call number range, E185.1 through 0.9, covers the entirety of African American history in the US from 1619 to Black Lives Matter. Suddenly, it seems a lot less equitable to remove the same number of books from this section as from the call number range E461 through 659, which is almost entirely biographies and military history for the 4 years of the Civil War. So how do we adjust our process to prevent this from happening? We need a way to evaluate the scholarly value of each volume, as well as consider the collection as a whole when we deselect. Neither of these can be easily measured quantitatively, and certainly not using circulation statistics. We need to collaborate with our user community, especially subject experts who know the literature better than most librarians. And to do that, we cannot expect good results with spreadsheets of thousands of titles. We should coordinate with our subject experts so that workloads and timelines for action are appropriate to the goals of creating a diverse and inclusive collection, while still moving forward with deselection to make space for new books, new study spaces, or new services.
Hi, so thanks, Adam. That was very informative and interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what, as a new librarian, just started working here about 2 weeks ago, and I'm in charge of collection development for English and Communication Studies here. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that I'm thinking about as I'm starting in this new position. So hopefully some of this might be helpful to some of you in thinking about diversity and collection development. So when I was thinking about this initially, I knew I wanted to avoid that tokenism and the idea of just sort of checking boxes when it comes to trying to have a diverse collection. And I also want to avoid buying things that students and the faculty will not use just because I'm trying to buy diverse. I'm at a smaller school than FSU, where I came from. It's about half the size. I don't have as big of a budget. I also don't have an approval plan. So I am actually approving every single title that I buy. So I want to buy materials that fit the needs of my community here because I don't have a lot of money to experiment with. But I also want to balance that with the realization that students especially tend to use what materials are available to them and that they can find easily, as I think most of us who have done collection development know. So unless I make those diverse materials available, they just aren't going to be used. And then I can just keep saying, well, only these, white or whatever materials are the ones being used, and use those metrics and those circulation stats, right, to continue to not buy diverse materials. So in thinking about what I'm doing, if I'm trying to buy diversity, I need to decide what diversity means and define my goals as a librarian. So part of my goals I decided when I started this job was that I wanted to support and promote research that is diverse, equitable, and inclusive. But I also want to think about it's really easy, I think, to say, oh, I can just collect this core of, say, Black studies and find lists that are, supposed to be representative of its discipline. But I wanted to go beyond that, because a lot of times the works on these core lists that we might find in research guides or on association lists are works that are the most acceptable to our academy. Or in other words, they might be materials that conform best to a white or a heteropatriarchal standard, however you want to add to that. So I want to think about ways to go beyond that core. So in an academic discipline like English, and I think this is true for a lot of humanities and social sciences as well, there's already a heavy use of critical theory lenses that I think we can use when we're thinking about diversity labels in diverse collection development. So there's feminist theory, queer theory, race studies, disability studies, all of those are a way to incorporate some diversity into the collection without buying things that maybe aren't going to be useful to our communities. So it might be tempting for me, and I think I was tempted at the beginning, is to look at our circulation reports or look at our English faculty's research interests and say that, for example, no one's doing disability studies, which, as a caveat, there are people here doing disability studies. It's just an example. But I might say, oh, there's no one doing that particular area, so there's no point in adding to that collection. Or I can go back to that core list, right, and collect what seems to be the sort of the seminal text of this of disability studies, and then think I did a good job, and I have this diverse collection, even though no one's going to probably check out a disability theory text from 1990. So this is where I need to go back to my goal. So how do I support diverse research for my students and for my faculty here? So maybe no one's doing disability studies, but there might be a professor who studies Victorian literature and teaches Victorian literature classes. There's a lot of scholarship on mental illness, disability, and its relationship to Victorian women's literature, and it has to do with the history of hysteria and all that I won't go into, although it's very interesting if you're interested in that. So a student who's in that class, who's in a Victorian literature class, might see that scholarship on disability studies pop up when they're searching the catalog. So I can collect materials in that subcategory and feel a lot more confident that material is going to get used and it's going to be useful for my community and for my students. Because students who are taking that class will see that material come up and might be able to use it. And it also will support my goal, which is to encourage and support my students and faculty who are doing diverse critical approaches with their own research. So, and again, if you're in humanities or if you're in social sciences, and I think even the sciences too, there's ways to think about how to incorporate what your community is already doing and sort of funnel that into a more diverse collection development strategy. Another example is maybe you have a professor that's teaching American realism in the 19th century. I can make sure that scholarship regarding Black authors and women authors and queer authors during that time period and that genre are included in the collection, even if that's maybe not the books they're reading for class. A lot of times in English, they can still write on books that are not included in the class. And so that will come up when they're doing their research, and it'll give opportunity for students to learn more and have a wider variety of materials to choose from. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. And I also want to add a final caveat to this, that you want to make sure I want to make sure that I'm collecting scholarship by authors with marginalized identities and not just only authors who are writing about people with marginalized identities. That's also a goal, and it might require a little more research on my part, but it's something that because having a diverse and equitable and inclusive collection is important to me, is something that I'm going to put the time in to do.
Thank you, Hannah. That was great. So in this last section, we're going to talk about moving forward. And a lot of what I'll be addressing in this section is from an ACRL presentation, the one from May this year. It's called Cultures of Collecting, Sustaining Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Collection Development. And the ideas I'll be referring to come from the three presenters, Tamar Evangelista Daltrey, who's the Associate Librarian of Rare and Distinctive Collections, Asian and Africana Collections at Cornell University, Roxanne Bukowski, the Electronic Resources Librarian at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and Scarlett Gavon, the Assessment and Planning and Collection Strategist Librarian at Grand Valley State University. One of the challenges of being forward-thinking in DEI and collections is making sure space has been made for historically excluded scholars, authors, and perspectives. Another challenge is that each individual librarian has their own idea of what DEI means to them. And as Evangelista Daltrey stated, quote, "These power structures and assumptions drive the decisions around collection development," end quote. Thinking critically, sitting with ideas and thoughts that make you uncomfortable in relation to DEI and collection development is a starting point on how to think about DEI and collection development. One of the many things that resonated with me in this presentation was thinking about decentering whiteness and holding ourselves accountable beyond diversity statements. That's where this Issa Rae meme comes from. And when I approached Adam and Hannah to work with me on this presentation, I had this meme in mind. The meme represents my values in general and in life. And when it comes to collection development at the predominantly white space that I work in. The title of this presentation is about moving beyond diversity statements and talking about DEI. It's also more than just acquiring new books from BIPOC authors or digitizing resources from BIPOC communities. We need to make sure we're centering those voices in the discussion and that we're highlighting voices. Evangelista Daltrey has a slide in her presentation called Research Methodology for Exclusive but Well-Meaning DEI Collection Development, where the method is acquisition and digitization of BIPOC collections alone. and how that can lead, just doing that work alone can lead to decolonization of a collection. But you can still end up with cultural appropriation. Even Logistia Daltrey recommends asking yourself these questions. Why are you collecting? Who are you collecting for? And she talks about moving beyond DEI and into belonging. Galvan talks about how collections in your library and how they exist currently are examples of your library and your university or college work culture, or just culture in general. Ideas about hiring, retention, policies are all white-centered because higher ed is predominantly white. Therefore, so are libraries. Galvan talks about how, quote, budget decisions are values decisions, end quote. And she spoke a lot about values in general, but when thinking about making collection development decisions, she thinks that we should ask and think critically about our values as workers, as librarians, as someone who's a part of an institution. What is non-negotiable to you, and is that a shared value at your institution? An example of this would be, is incorporating open educational resources in collection development a non-negotiable value for you? When you think about this and you discuss it, you can move towards writing those things into policy. Evangelista Daltrey talks about some common missteps. And one of the things that sticks out with me is like being mindful and thinking about your colleagues who identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, and to see what they're currently working on. There's a difference between asking your BIPOC colleagues to do the work for you and then being asked to be, and then asking and being authentically inclusive and asking them to work with you on identifying needs. She talks a lot about helicopter outreach and cultural ghosting, which are new terms to me. So I definitely recommend viewing that presentation. Once again, there's a link in the bibliography. She also talks about a framework to actualize DEI in collection development. And the steps she recommends taking are reflection. So look at past and present acquisitions and approval plans. What do they look like? She recommends being realistic. What is the reality of the resources that you need to make changes? And being honest about your institutional culture and what they prioritize in selectors and curatorial acquisition budgets. What anti-racist or social justice benchmarks do you want to establish in your collection? Consistency matters, and having a shared vision is important. And then who are your allies, the resistors, and the skeptics? Be realistic about barriers that will prevent you from doing this work and from this work actually happening. What are the power structures at your institution? And are you prepared to have these difficult conversations? Does your library administration support you? I'm thinking about all of this stuff as I move forward with my collection development. And one of the goals that I have in the upcoming academic year is to either do a survey or a forum with the BIPOC members of my departments, including students and faculty, to hear about their experiences in the library and their experiences with the collection. Thinking about this logistically, I want to center those voices in what's needed. I want to think about collection gaps, and I want to build relationships with BIPOC voices at FSU. So that is the end of our presentation. We would like to open the floor up. We have our bibliography, of course, but now is the time if there are any questions. Or if Adam or Hannah have anything else they'd like to add. Well, thank you all for your time today. We're really excited to get some questions.
I have one. You can hear me? Okay. So my library is also working, we're calling it more collection management. And we have discussed a lot as a group, and we're excited to include a section in this document on diversity. But it's a big project to tackle. We don't have a giant budget. And it's hard to know where to start, or we need a concrete way to measure. We know that our collection needs to be more diverse, but how do we know when it, I don't know, I was just wondering if you had any guidelines that could help.
I can jump in first. I think one of the things in figuring out if your own collection is diverse is first defining what diversity means for your institution. It's going to be different for every library, right? Because we all have a different audience, a different user base that we're working with. So is it meeting the needs of the people who are using your library? And I think even when you have a limited budget, you can make decisions about how you're going to distribute those resources, how you might, I don't know if it means like setting up separate funds so that you make sure you're spending the money in certain ways, or if you can integrate, depending on how who has the budget making decisions and who's making actual purchase choices, can you write into your acquisition policy, your collection development policies, what types of materials you're trying to bring in that would help to diversify the collection. So I think we don't have specific answers. I think this is actually quite difficult because it is different for every library is what this means. And we already talked about how quantitative measures don't always quite get to the crux of it.
I know.
They can certainly be part of the solution, but it may just be thinking about your collection in the totality. How hard is it to find BIPOC authors? How hard is it to find information about the history of indigenous peoples as it relates to what your users are looking for?
Right. I guess the way my brain works, I want a formula, like, because it's easy to get the demographics of the population we serve. And then, I don't know, based on that, what should we prioritize? I guess because of the small budget, I think we're all excited to do better. It's just we want to make the most with what we have. And I went to the same place you guys did, the ALA's interpretation that you talked about at the beginning. And I reached out, and I do feel validated that everybody I talk to, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, we're all really doing our best. It's not, I guess there's not a right or wrong way to go about it as long as you're trying. But I guess that's difficult. It feels too vague for me, and I don't know. I want to be able to run a report and know exactly what I need to do, but I guess maybe we'll get there eventually.
Yeah, one thing I would suggest is to not think of it as like a place you can arrive at. It's like you're always going to be doing this work. You're always going to be working towards making sure that you're inclusive in your collection. So that might be just thinking about the ways that you are approaching it. So like I would repeat what Adam said, which is like define what you all mean by diversity first, and then you can kind of, tackle it that way. But also to think about like there's a point where you arrive and it's like, oh, the collection is diverse, like we did it. That's not a good way of thinking about it, in my opinion.
Well, I guess that's any collection management at all. But I mean, there is like, I guess like a cutoff point where, you're not doing great as far as like maybe the age of the collection or the diversity of the collection. But then there is a point where it's like, okay, we've got it. We're doing a lot better. And I think you're right with any aspect of the collection. You're never finished. You're always working on it. But it would just feel good to know that and I guess
the right direction.
Hmm?
Yeah. To know you're going in the right direction.
Right. Yeah. But thank you guys. This was all really great.
Hi. Sarah, Adam, Mallory, Hannah, great discussion. I bring you greetings. I bring greetings to this group from Broward College. I am the Associate Dean, new in the position only since December 7th, but if you can guess, I've been on this path for a long time, more than 25 years. And so the comments that I'm going to make are kind of general, but then the specific of it. One statement that I often hear is that collection development is driven by the curriculum and not by agenda or the wanting for a social agenda. How do you answer that question? I also hear that collection management development is driven by the faculty. And oftentimes it's like pulling teeth to get the faculty involved in even reviewing what's in the collection. How also, and I obviously am totally in favor of moving to DEI and inclusiveness, but from the back end, when you take these steps, do you see an increase in checkout or usage statistics to sort of validate that because we're doing these things, our resources are now being used, checked out? So I'd sort of like to get some feedback on at least some of the points that questions that I've asked. Thank you.
I thank you for your comments and questions. I will honestly say that that is a very difficult position that I've had a very large privilege of not like running into. My background, I was a children's librarian for 2 years where we had limited funds, but I've always in my career as a librarian, I've always been given basically the leeway to kind of collect as I feel, to spend the money as I want. So even when I had a smaller budget at the public library, I was never told, no, you can't buy that because of stats or circulation. I was always told you can buy what you want to buy. And then at FSU, I have a much larger budget and a lot more leeway. So running into those types of issues is not something I've had to face as a librarian. So I'm not sure if I'm the best person.
Well, I'd like to hear from someone, Sarah, you touched on it. It's within this group, there is tremendous diversity in terms of years of librarianship and sizes of the different libraries and budgets. I think that may be a common theme, that everyone has had budget gaps. So I'd like to hear from others who have dealt with these challenges.
Yeah, I think as far as the budget goes, it pains me to feel like in my mind I have to create a hierarchy of what to focus on first. It doesn't seem the right way to do it. But when you are so limited, I mean, you almost can't help it. And we've talked about it as a group, and we've agreed to just take the tiniest baby steps to get where we need to go so we don't get overwhelmed. And it's going well so far. I think we all feel positive, but it's like, what do we focus on first? There are so many categories, because we have talked about what it means to us, and there's so many things we want to include. And so I guess that's the struggle that we're facing right now, what to focus on first.
Thank you. Well, I'm going back on mute.
Do we have any other questions from anyone? Okay, well, if not, I will go ahead and officially thank our presenters again and for our participants. And just be on the lookout for the recording when Regina sends that message out. And don't forget to fill out your survey when you get that. All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks, y'all.